All right, today we're going to be continuing with our science lesson, which is the web of life. And so this particular unit is called What Do Plants Eat?
Hi, it's Doug. If you're someone who likes to eat bacon at breakfast, but you aren't always a fan of eating your vegetables at dinner, here's an idea for you to try out on your parents. You could tell them, I'm always eating vegetables. There's a way in which that's true. I mean, think about the food chain that's involved. Bacon is meat that comes from a pig. What do pigs eat in order to grow big? Well, maybe you don't know what pigs eat, so you look it up and you find out that pigs on a farm eat mostly corn and soybeans. Corn and soybeans, those are plants. Pig meat somehow comes from the plants that the pigs ate. So there you go. In a way, eating bacon is really like having a helping of vegetables. Now, what if you don't eat bacon? Say that you prefer hamburger instead. Well, no worries. Again, think about the food chain. Hamburger is meat from a cow. What do cows eat? They graze on grass. Plants again. Not a fan of hamburgers? Okay, so let's consider chicken. What do chickens eat? They eat seeds. Again, that's plants. But now, just for fun, let's say your chickens are wild chickens. So they're not just eating seeds, they're also eating the occasional little beetle. But then what do those beetles eat? They eat plants. So you get the idea. Everything comes down to plants, every time, when you follow the food chain. And not just for human beings who eat meat, but for any animal that eats any other kind of animal. When you ask the question, what does it eat? And you keep asking that question, you always wind up back at plants. So if all these things in the end are just eating things that eat things that eat things that eat plants, it makes you wonder, so what do plants eat then? Well, let's consider that today. But let's not think about just any little plant. If we're going to talk about what plants eat, we might as well talk about the king kahuna of all the plants, the largest plant in the world. It's this. It's actually the largest living thing in the world, larger even than any animal. It's a tree. We're looking up, looking up. Keep going, keep going. I'll wait for it here. This kind of tree is called a sequoia. All sequoia trees are massive like this, but this particular one I'm showing you is the biggest of them all. It's an individual tree growing in eastern California. It's so large that it's even got its own name. People call it General Sherman. General Sherman weighs, are you ready for this? 4 million pounds. That's the same weight as about 300 elephants. But where does all that 4 million pounds of tree come from? Now, it's tempting to think that sequoia trees like this are just always huge. They just exist. But walking around on the forest floor, you can find these. It's a sequoia cone. It's like a pine cone. And if you shake it, you'll find that inside are the seeds of a sequoia tree. Even General Sherman started out once as just a little seed like this, no bigger than a grain of oat from your oatmeal. How did it get so big? How does any plant gain weight? If we were talking about a person or an elephant instead of a tree, then you'd have some easier guesses. You'd say, well, living things like animals and human beings, they gain weight because they eat food. But plants? What do plants eat? Do they even eat? What is a plant's food?
All right, perfect. So right now, I want you guys to grab your science notebooks. And at the top of the page, you're going to write, what do plants eat with today's date? So do that now. Pause me while you go get your science notebooks. And again, at the top, you're going to write, what do plants eat? So the question is, all that 4 million pounds of wood must have come from somewhere. What do you think plants eat? Do they even eat? So you're answering two questions. Number one, do they eat? Number two, what do plants eat? Pause now and come back to the video as soon as you're done. All right. The second question is, how could you find out? And really, I guess the third question, how could you find out what a plant eats? So again, write down quickly how you could find out if a plant eats and what they eat. Pause me now and then come back as soon as you're done. All right, moving on. Here we go.
So you might be thinking that plants eat dirt, right? That's what lots of people assume is true. And that's a perfectly logical thing to think. I mean, plants grow in dirt, or what in scientific language we often call soil instead. So that's what I'll call it from now on. Plants have their roots in the soil. So maybe the roots are eating that soil. For hundreds of years, this is even what scientists assumed to be true. Plants must be eating soil, they thought. They assumed that soil was where plants get their weight from. But no one had ever actually checked to see if this was true. Eventually, one scientist, this guy, got really curious about this. He wondered, are we sure that plants eat soil? And he came up with a very clever experiment, which he hoped would help him solve the mystery. Here was his idea. He decided that he would plant a young tree in a pot. Now, before doing that, he would carefully weigh the tree and the soil that he was going to place into the pot. The tree weighed about 2 pounds, the soil about 200 pounds. After weighing and planting the tree, he watered it and made sure that it got all the sunlight it needed too. A few years later, once the tree had grown to be bigger like this, he took it out of the pot again and measured the weight of the tree and then the weight of the soil. Do you see his idea here? Remember, the original weight of the tree was about 2 pounds, and the original weight of the soil about 200 pounds. After the tree had grown, the tree now weighed about 160 pounds. So the tree had gained a huge amount of weight. But now what about the soil? If the tree had been eating the soil, if soil is a tree's food, then what do you think he would discover when he went to weigh the soil?
Okay, so this is a really interesting thought here. The first thing that pops into my head is, oh my gosh, he must have had the biggest pot ever, because how could you fit a big tree that's now 160 pounds plus those 200 pounds of soil? But let's get back on track. So go ahead and take a guess. If the tree had been eating soil, then what do you think the scientist will notice? And why do you think that? So think, if the tree did eat soil, what do you think the scientist would find? So originally that was a 2 pound tree, and now it's 160 pounds. And the soil was originally 200 pounds, but now what do you think the soil will weigh? Pause and answer this question. All right, moving on.
So, where did General Sherman get all the material that it's made of? All that bark, all the wood inside the tree? How did a tree get to weigh 4 million pounds? Was it all from eating soil? Let's look back at that scientist's experiment. After 5 years, once his small tree had grown and gained weight, he carefully took it out of the pot, he weighed the tree, and he weighed the soil. The tree weighed 160 pounds. It had gained a lot of weight compared to the 2 pounds it started at. But to his amazement, the soil had barely changed in weight. It started at 200 pounds and now was only just 199.8 pounds. It lost almost nothing, just the tiniest amount. So that 158 pounds of new tree, it couldn't have come from the soil. The scientist Van Helmont was convinced. Plants don't get most of their weight from soil. His experiment showed it. Mystery solved. Sort of. Because think about it. If plants aren't getting their weight from soil, we still haven't solved where they do get their weight from. Van Helmont thought about this. Now, the only thing he knew he'd added to his young tree during those 5 years of its growth were sunlight and water. Now, he knew that even though all plants need sunlight, sunlight itself wasn't adding any weight to the plant. Sunlight's a form of energy. It's not a material. Scientists today know that plants use sunlight for their energy, but they're not made of sunlight. Sunlight doesn't weigh anything. So that just leaves water. If you cut open a plant, even if you cut open a tree, you can feel some wetness. So there's evidence that water is part of a plant. The scientists who did this thought, well, maybe plants somehow create their weight just from the water they take in. Or to put it another way, he thought, aha, so maybe plants don't eat. They just drink. But Van Helmont could only think this because there was something he didn't know yet. He didn't know that there's another material that plants take in besides just water. Much later than his lifetime, scientists using microscopes discovered something very interesting on the underside of plants' leaves. It looks like this. They look like little microscopic mouths. And they act like them too. They're even able to open and close. Scientists decided to call them stomata, from the Greek word for mouth. But what on earth are these little mouths on the underside of leaves doing? Could they be taking something in, adding weight to the plant? In fact, scientists were able to figure out that the stomata are taking in air from around the plant. And not just some air, lots of air, all day long. So some scientists did experiments trying to stop the plant from getting air by covering up the stomata. And they found out that when they did this, the plant would die in a matter of days. So it must have been that the plants were doing something with that air that was coming in through the stomata. Could it be that air is an important food used by plants in order to help them grow? Now, the problem is, air is about as light a thing as you can imagine. Is there really any way that plants like General Sherman, which weighs 4 million pounds, could be gaining in weight because of air it's taking in through its leaves? What do you think? I mean, does air even weigh anything at all?
All right, and this is your last question for today, so make sure you're putting these in your notebook. So question is, do you think that air weighs anything? And I should remind you, when you guys are in your science notebooks, your writer's notebooks, your social studies notebooks, you're always answering the question by restating the question. For example, you might say, I believe that air is very heavy. Or, I believe that air does not weigh anything. So you're restating your question in your answer. If you just write yes or no, that's not a fifth grade response. So first question, do you think that air weighs anything? Pause and write your answer now. And the last question for today, what could you do to find out? We're talking about air here. Does it weigh anything? How could you find out if air weighs anything? So think of an experiment that would let you weigh air. When you guys are done, you're going to turn this in, a picture of your science notebook in, please. And tomorrow we will be watching the experiment.